Welcome to the IPX True North podcast, where we connect people, processes, and tools.
Welcome to the True North podcast. I'm Joseph Anderson, your host. Today, I'm joined with Dr. Nate Hartman from Purdue University. Nate, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. So today we're going to actually have part two of our series. Part one, we really talked about U.S. manufacturing, the investment arms, and the need for the federal and state level support mechanisms. And as we rolled out that conversation, we realized that it really needed to be a two-part series. And today we're going to talk about the word assessment, what that means at the education and provider level, but also the industry level. You know, from an IPX perspective, we own really the IP for the ability to go in and assess the operational ecosystem of any business, of any corporation. And you're talking from the as designed to as decommission on the product side, the process side. And then we also have the same capability to do that DNA assessment on the organizational side, right? So as recruited, as hired, as fostered, there's a lot there for that model, but we're able to go in and give you an as-is state of your organization and even a university. And that's quite powerful if used correctly,
right?
And actually used as a competitive advantage. And understanding where you're at allows you to map out the blueprint for that to-be state and also to foster continual improvement. So Nate, I look forward to having this conversation. We ended part one really with you getting ready to dive into, some of the norms and behaviors of how assessments have been utilized and looked at in the past, and maybe a way to transition to using those as a competitive advantage for continual improvement.
Sure.
So I'm just going to open up the mic to you and let's do our thing. And again, I apologize to the audience. I am not a professional host. My vocabulary is limited at best. So, Nate's going to make me look good. So Nate, let's do this.
All right. Well, we left off last time beginning to talk about the idea of assessments. And I think anytime you think about assessment, it's really what you're often thinking. Maybe not all the time, but what you're often thinking is I know where I am today, or right this minute, and I know where I would like to be sometime in the future. And so what is that delta? What is that difference between those two states of being? And as people, we apply that construct of assessment to a lot of different situations, right? Our just moving through the everyday world, right? We assess what's happening in our environments around us, right? We assess what's happening when we cross the street, when we drive our car, when we interact with our families, right? And then we react to that, or we implement certain techniques of activity, of communication, of what have you, right? And those are just the things that we almost do subconsciously, right? Some would argue, even though those are the things, or thinking about those kinds of things that way is somewhat esoteric, because a lot of times an assessment tends to be rather deliberate. We don't accidentally assess something, right? So maybe bringing this a little closer to the things we've typically talked about in this podcast series, you can often think, at least I do anyway, of assessments as almost a form of a quality control function, or of a continuous improvement kind of a strategy, where you're looking at and evaluating what's happening right now, and again, where you would like to be or what you would like to see happen. And then there's a gap there, right? And you mentioned assessing not just products, but organizations. And I think that's something that's particularly important. And we can also talk about assessing people as well. Not necessarily from a punitive perspective, but again, from a continuous improvement perspective. And when we talk about manufacturing and we talk about competitiveness, we talk about how the future of U.S. manufacturing might look, or maybe even Midwestern manufacturing might look, right? We know what it was like historically. We know that we face certain challenges as a state, as a region, as a country, arguably even as a world. We know we face certain challenges. How we're going to overcome those challenges, and those could be social challenges, they could be economic challenges, they could be competitive ones around intellectual property or around market placement or what have you. They could take a number of forms, right? But we can also talk about them in the context of workforce development, of continuous improvement, of a strategy for manufacturing. So that's really where I think we should focus. And so when we talk about assessment, normally you develop some kind of a way to gather data about the existing state, right? The existing set of conditions, the existing circumstances, whatever those may be. It's as kids in school, we would take tests, right? And that was really the teacher's way of trying to understand, what did we know? How much might we know? They would hopefully, look at that as a way to say, okay, well, I tried to teach the students this particular topic, this particular way. I designed a test that was hopefully a way to measure what they knew. These scores tell me on some normative scale what they know or don't know, right? And then I'll make decisions about my teaching and the kinds of things that we'll cover and so on. And I think in general, that is not unlike, say a manufacturing engineer who plans a particular process, who implements that process, who then begins to sample products coming from that process, right? We look at that data, we see where we have variation, and then we adjust accordingly, right? That's not a new scheme. We've been doing that for a long time.
If you're good at what you do, you adjust, right? Even from an educated
right. If you're good at what you do, you adjust.
Right. And that the word continuous, for those of you that have heard me maybe speak a couple times, I'm more a proponent of the word continual, and, especially for assessments. And why do I say that? Because from the industry perspective, that continuous improvement, that continuous word just means it's constant, right? Mm-hmm. It's constant. Continual is a focus on improvement, but measuring and monitoring. Mm-hmm. And that's our approach at IPX. And I really think that's where you're going down the path is we need ways to measure and monitor where we're at. And not make it and I'm not here to change the education system, but I've taken plenty of tests in my life, and typically they were either good or bad, and you get graded on that. And there's that inherent fear of, quite frankly, oh shit, if I don't nail this test, all the work I've done up to this point, I'm going to be critiqued on that result.
Well, and a lot of that I think comes from the idea that for better or for worse over time, we were not necessarily comparing to a standard, right? We started comparing people against other people. True. Right? We started racking and stacking scores on a distribution, right? Yeah. It's not exact, and this is where it departs, right, from the manufacturing analogy, is that, when I'm, say, taking a measurement of the outside diameter of a particular component, right, and I want to see whether or not my manufacturing process is in check, I know how many I'm going to produce in that lot. I know that statistically speaking, I should sample this many and I should measure them, and I should do that at this particular frequency, and then I'll get a sense of whether or not my process is in control. Right. But I'm not necessarily comparing this part against this part against this part. What I'm comparing is this part against some dimensional standard, right? And it's a rather binary, is it good or is it not? Is it acceptable or is it not, based on the design specifications I've established? Workforce development is a different kind of a comparison. And that's maybe where the two analogies diverge from me, or where the analogy diverges in these two areas, right? This idea of assessment is arguably I should, from a training and education perspective, be comparing to a particular standard. However, I think this is where human beings tend to go off the rails a little, and that is we start comparing people to other people, right? Because we want a certain performance out of a particular kind of an individual. And so I think our challenge there is having that not become a punitive or competitive situation that gets out of hand and does not promote, a strong workforce. I mean, and again, I think it's important for the listeners, right? I'm not arguing that we should not be competitive, right? What I'm arguing is how we assess whether or not we are competitive. And I think therein lies the differences. And unfortunately, over the last number of years, you've seen instances where, those in charge have, spoken with resources or, the rescinding thereof, in learning and training kinds of environments where things did not measure up, right? On one hand, do we have scrap, if you will, in a manufacturing environment? Sure. Right. And over the years, the quality community has come to accept certain levels of that, right? Because the variability is always going to be there. And even though you try to reduce it, it's nigh impossible to remove it all, right? But yet when we talk about workforce development, we talk about training, we talk about education, we have tried to, as a people, apply various behavioral conditions to that kind of environment when human beings, at least from a learning perspective, are inherently highly variable, right? And so I think even though we strive towards continual improvement, we strive towards establishing a workforce development environment or a training and education environment in a way that is conducive for people to learn, I think the challenge we have is we tend to regress backwards, if you will, from an evaluation point of view, and it no longer becomes a continual improvement exercise. It becomes an exercise based in judgment or an exercise based in penalties. And most people, from a working perspective, don't perform particularly well that way. And so, again, going back maybe a little bit to our last episode where we talked about this idea of communities of practice, we talked about ecosystems, we talked about how a lot of the challenges that we experience in a manufacturing environment, or I'll just say in general, product design and production kind of an environment, right? These often tend to be systemic, right, in nature. Rarely are they confined to one particular, say, person or machine or variable, right? There tends to be an awful lot of interaction between a number of people, a number of machines, a number of variables. And so, taking sort of a punitive view, if you will, of assessment, oftentimes doesn't lead you to any better results than you had before, at least over time.
And I think this is a great point. What you're talking about is very true from an industry as well. Mm-hmm. And a lot of companies, a lot of organizations, a lot of governments, a lot of universities talk about continuous and or continual improvement. And we have the Six Sigmas, we have the ability to do a statistical analysis on our data set and find some of those outliers, those systemic issues. But from my perspective, the frustrating element is there's a disconnect between this is what the data is telling us and the knowledge to make an improvement, a functional, tangible value add improvement. And what happens is we have these companies and these individuals, I've been there, I've been on the other side, we'll invest in a new tool. we'll invest in tweaking a process, but where we really don't want to put investment is training for our people.
Right.
Well, it's almost comical because you're not going to improve, at an order of magnitude, those systemic issues if you don't have a mechanism for workforce development, training, and education on modern practices and standards. And there's got to be there's going to be different flavors based off functions, and you might have certification level, you might have micro series level, you might have workshop level. But from my side of the house, the frustration is you get these individuals that they get so locked down into controlling how training should be, and that's not their expertise. They were hired to be an engineer or a manager or a director. Their expertise isn't education, but they get so they get that fear factor that if we do this incorrectly or we train too many, we're not going to be successful. And I think it's the opposite. If you have a way for your organization and your workforce to continually learn, to have a mechanism where you foster that education and assessment, and you allow yourself to be assessed by an outside, I don't care who you work with, but if you don't have an unbiased outside entity assessing you, you're really not going to get a true assessment. I'm in my 40s. Every year for the last, I would say, 5 years, I have a certain standard of how I want to be physically and mentally in shape. I have failed every year. I was an athlete, many years ago, and I know what it takes to get there, and I know how to assess myself out a little bit. But I'm not a professional, so I've decided that this year my audio will match my video. Personally, I'm going to hire someone to assess me physically and mentally because I want to be in good shape. I want to be in the best shape I can for longevity. I have 2 children. I want to be around for a while. And I want to be able to, outrun and out wrestle, my children and my nephew. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow an unbiased entity to put me through a physical assessment. Here's my goal, and I want you to assess my as-is state. And I want you to critique me. And then I want you to help me get to where I want to go. So measure and monitor my steps, because I know if I do it myself, eventually, quite honestly, it's going to fall to, as soon as I can get to a pile, and I'm never going to get to it.
Right.
And I think that's, a little bit of what we're talking about now is how do we hold ourselves accountable as an entity to be assessed and to use that as an advantage to actually sustain and scale.
It's an interesting point because it is possible to over assess.
Yeah.
And you see it everything from sampling error in a production environment to machine or process breakdown in a production environment to you think about it from a learning and training perspective. There's, it is possible for people to essentially learn from an exam, right? Now, in an ideal world, they would do that. And then enough time would pass to where you did not have some sort of a testing effect if you assess them again, right? But if you're continuously assessing too frequently, folks learn how to sort of take a test, if you will, right? People learn how certain problems around certain topics are often configured, right? Why do we have study guides for standardized tests, right? If you've ever taken the SAT or the ACT or any of the, LSAT or GMAT or any of these graduate school or university level entrance exams, there are entire industries out there about prepping for those exams, right? Yet, do they make a difference? Maybe for some people they probably do, but for others, I'm not sure they do, right? And so it's maybe too simplistic of an example for what we're talking about here, but the point is it is possible to over measure and to over assess. And so to your point about the difference between continual and continuous, right? Monitoring is one thing, but to intervene
Correct.
and then try to change the system is a different kind of thing. And each one has its own risks and rewards.
Absolutely.
But, I agree with you that it's important to differentiate between those things. So, I guess maybe just, at least from my end, to kind of wrap up that particular thread of our discussion is really, I think if we're going to train and educate a new workforce, and by train, and a reason I said both of those words, train and educate, right, is that at some level we're working people along a continuum, right, of awareness about a topic to some level of literacy, to competency, and then to mastery. And now, does everyone have to get all the way to the mastery level on that scale? No, not necessarily, right? But we can assess our environment. Maybe it's our company, maybe it's our region. It can assess on whatever level you want.
Yeah.
But and people should make decisions about how much or what proportion of the people in the organization or in the region do they want to be simply aware that these concepts exist, right? And then literate, competent, master, and so on. And so I think it's and how do we get to that? Well, whether people like this fact or not, training and education take time. They take time to do, but they also take time to prepare. They take time to perfect. They take time that is somewhat iterative in nature. And that's just development of the program or the content or the environment, depending upon the topic that you're actually trying to cover. But then there's the human side of people actually learning something. And there are all kinds of learning styles and all kinds of ways people learn, right? That not necessarily the topic for today per se,
Right.
but the idea being, you mentioned machine learning, artificial intelligence, those concepts, right? Many of which have not necessarily been generated with the fourth industrial revolution, but have certainly become more relevant now that we are here in the fourth industrial revolution. And so, I think there's certainly ground to plow there when it comes to
For sure.
to those kinds of technologies.
And I want to talk about that for a little while. And because when we talk about assessment, it doesn't necessarily have to be a static assessment. And we talk about the consumer relationship with the product, with the manufacturer, the designer. There's a lot of data there when we start talking about machine learning and what the consumer is experiencing. That should be part of the assessment. I'm bringing this up. Sorry, Nate, I'm going to use you as an example. For
That's
those
right.
of you listening to us, you can't see Nate's hands. They look like he got in a fight with like a small Wolverine. I mean, they're just chewed up. And I'm just, again, here I am just throwing Nate under the bus. But his hands are chewed up, and I'm sure it's quite uncomfortable. And, I don't know if he was, I didn't know if he was pulling, roses or what when I got here this morning. But Nate,
I was fighting a Wolverine outside.
Yeah, with one hand and pulling roses with the other. But, I'm going to let Nate add some data to this. But, Nate's hands, the reason his hands are kind of cut up is just from a product assembly.
Yeah.
And Nate can give some more to this, but there's been recalls, and your product's not been recalled, but I talk about this all the time because it just baffles my mind. As consumers, we've kind of become complacent, but I think we've almost given up with manufacturers because do they really care? Are they really assessing themselves? And honestly, if I ran an organization that built a product that injured somebody in any way, not only would I improve that, but I would use that as a training and education opportunity for my entire workforce. Because throughout our process, on the operational side,
Yeah.
that DNA side, there's some breakdowns there. If once our product is delivered to a consumer and they have to assemble it, if they're injured because of defects in our product, we got to improve that.
Yeah.
And I want to educate my workforce to make sure it doesn't happen again. So if you don't mind, Nate, we got a real world example here. Wolverine 0, Nate 1. But kind of walk us through a little bit this. We're not going to name any names, but this is a good example of, from conceptual to as delivered, and then as assembled with the consumer.
Yeah.
We've had a breakdown.
The problem that occurred was I was not wrestling a Wolverine. I had purchased a new piece of fitness equipment from my home gym, and it came in, I don't know, it was about, 7 or 8, 9 different pieces, all made out of metal. Some components were simply polished, some were powder coated and or painted. But as I'm going to assemble it, as I began putting the pieces together, unfortunately, I ended up getting both of my hands cut up because of some burrs and some weld flashing that was still on the product and so on, which not uncommon, not unexpected in a manufacturing environment, especially of components that are made out of tubular steel or the like. But it's not what I would have expected to have happened, with a product that clearly has, one, to be assembled by the consumer. Secondly, a product where, you're obviously going to place your hands in certain spots on the product, whether it's to assemble it or use it. And so, it's been an unfortunate circumstance. And so I, certainly not that I haven't had my hands cut up by by machine parts before, but the point is that, it wasn't something that I had expected. So I actually went to the company's website. I submitted on their web form. I just, essentially told them what happened. I'm not necessarily looking for compensation. I'm not necessarily looking for them to really do anything other than I was just simply trying to make them aware that, hey, look, you may have had a bit of a quality escape here, or you need to have a look at your packaging, shipping, and handling, what have you. I did notice when I opened the box that there were a couple of the metal components that were sort of floating freely in the box. Now, I don't know if at one point in time they were packed and, just over the process became unpacked, but, be that as it may, I got my hands cut up for a bit. So I think it's when we think about assessment, when we think about continual improvement, when we think about quality, it isn't just about, making sure that my product isn't going to break or isn't necessarily going to perform, but, there's a bit of a safety issue there as well. And so, particularly, I think if you make products where your customer has to, either partially or completely assemble them when they arrive.
Yeah. And I think that's having that data, again, to reference that, it doesn't have to be static, but how could we use that data to improve not just our product design, our next iteration of product, our manufacturing, our quality operations, but how are we utilizing that to communicate, and train and educate our workforce? But and it's the same, I think, I would assume at in the education sector. Mm-hmm. How are we assessing, the output, mm-hmm. From a student base going into, a career? What can we do there from a future capability to measure and monitor and to utilize that data? And to me, I don't have the answers to that one. On the industry side, there's got to be, and at the state and federal level as well, if you're going to invest into these organizations, you have to have some level of as-is assessment.
Right.
And then you want that to evolve into a to be state, at certain iterations. You don't want to overassess, as you stated, but you do want to monitor that to ensure you don't get outside of those guardrails.
I think, Joe, to that point, one of the things we really could consider doing is having a little more connectedness between our formal education environments like school and our informal education environments. And informal, so it is this is a bit of terminology in the educational world. There's formal and there's informal learning, okay? Formal is exactly what you think it is. It's school, right? You're typically in a classroom or a lab setting. There's students, there's teachers, there's a defined curriculum, there are defined assessments. Typically you're working against some kind of a standard, in like the K-12 space. Every state has educational standards that they use. Post-secondary, when you get into community college, university, not really state standards per se, but certainly, you have requirements in the syllabus. You got to pass the course in order to get your degree, kind of thing. So, there is some sense of standard there, but the point being is that we've heard a lot these days about lifelong learning, right? And that is one of those buzzwords that's not just a buzzword in academia, it's a buzzword in industry too.
Absolutely.
And so the idea being, though, is that in order to, at least in Nate Hartman's opinion, in order to be a good lifelong learner, you need some kind of connectedness between whatever it was you experienced as your formal education to what you now experience in your informal education. And in an informal education setting, that could be everything from hobbyist types of activities like woodworking in your garage, or working on your car, to painting, to sculpting, to those kinds of things, or even to some degree on-the-job training. Now, certainly there is classroom style training, if you will, in industrial organizations, for sure. And whether it be a physical classroom or, with today's technologies, it could be a virtual classroom of sorts. But what I'm talking about with informal learning is not a classroom setting. It's something that you do either on your own as a hobbyist, if you will, or it's more akin to on-the-job training. Yeah. Or one might even say on-the-job learning, because there may not be anyone there presently training you, so to speak. You might simply be developing your own techniques, your own knowledge, your own way of working. Right. Now, there's good parts to that, and there's bad parts to that. And so one of the things I think that we need to do to really have an innovative and entrepreneurial style workforce that is ready for the next industrial revolution, whenever that may come, is that there is a much tighter than it is today, integration between formal learning and informal learning over the life course of that person, or over the work life of that person.
No, and I think, to close out this episode, I see a lot of value also in having some of these. We used to do them a lot more than, the pandemic, of course, stopped to that. We used to have a lot of kind of show and tells throughout industry and education. So we would do a tour of a facility, and we get, some like-minded individuals together, and, from a non-trade secret, try to really share ways to improve and assess. And I think that comes to some of that, boots on the ground learning opportunity. And I hope we get back to that. I look forward to that. And for me, it's going to be interesting. It goes back to part one. Again, it's part of that support network as well.
Right.
When you start talking about assessments and how are we going to use those as an entity, regardless of if you're industry or education, or government, there's an opportunity here if you hold yourself accountable and you invest in it. And it's not just from financial, it's time.
Right.
You know? But again, Nate, great conversation for our listeners. There's a lot here, and I do look forward to discussing these further and future episodes, because, you know, for us to really thrive, you know, and I use the word sustain and scalability probably too much, but, you know, as a small business, you know, we've navigated, you know, the onset of COVID, a year of inflation and supply chain decimation, and then evolution and change. That's still that churn is still here.
Right.
And now we're looking at, you know, and navigating a recession, you know, and that's hard for any organization, but we continually assess ourselves, you know, and we've made some mistakes, but we're adjusting. So we do, you know, our audio and video match on that. But I think there's a lot of organizations that they're missing a mark there. So again, Nate, thanks for joining me on this episode. It's been a pleasure. For our listeners, stay tuned. I believe Nate and I will be talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning. In the next episode, we're going to open up Pandora's box on that one. But Nate, thanks for joining me.
Thanks again, Joe. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe and review the show. And for more information on IPX, visit ipxhq.com.